Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Gord Podcast. This is your host, Lord Gord, and I'm giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. And we're upside down. I've got 'em going inside out and round and round. Okay, so this week, I'm going to talk about the basement of fashion standards and how our societal standards for the fashion of men and women have fallen off of a cliff since the 1960s. Let's just get into this. Before the 1960s, there were clear societal standards of dress for men and women. There was an expectation of class and modesty for both. If you were a man, you wore slacks and a collared shirt if you were leaving the house. If you were a woman, you wore respectable dresses, blouses, and skirts. The destabilizing force for the high societal standards was the leftist counterculture movement of the 1960s. That same movement that brought you stuff like feminism, cultural and moral relativism, racial resentment and grievance and hostility, so on and so forth. So after this, our societal standards fell, non-judgmentalism became the credo of the day, and chaos ensued. So I'm going to talk about men for a little bit. Men, for example, did not wear jeans unless they were in construction or they were children. There was a clear hierarchy of sartorial choices. If you're a man and you left the house, you wanted to portray yourself as someone of high esteem, someone who carried themselves with dignity, and someone who carried themselves with class. Men were also expected to be strong and to provide for themselves and their women. And obviously with the welfare state, we started excusing men from their moral and fiscal responsibility to take care of the mother of their children, and I did a podcast on that before. Check that one out if you haven't listened to it already. I'm not going to go into it here. So once the leftist revolution hit, everything was thrown out of equilibrium. I watched a documentary a while ago. It was a documentary on Jackie Robinson, and they showed footage of these baseball games, and men in the audience were wearing nice double-breasted suits, and women were wearing nice coats and fancy clothes. You would never see that at a baseball game today. You probably would never see that at any kind of sporting event or public event today. Is it because people in the 40s and the 50s were richer than people now? No. Is it because people faced more discrimination now than then? No. So what it really was a societal standard. It wasn't a law. It was just understood by everyone that if you were a dignified person and you were leaving the house, you presented yourself with class. You didn't leave the house wearing pajamas. You didn't leave the house wearing blue jeans and t-shirts, okay? Unless you're going to the beach or something like that. You weren't sagging your pants or wearing scantily clad clothes where nothing could be left to the imagination of men and women alike. No, you presented yourself as a dignified American. Okay? Previously, children wanted to dress like adults, and adults wanted to dress like adults. By the 70s, everyone wanted to dress like children. I was watching a lecture. It was Diana West, Death of the Grown Up. I think she touched on this a little bit. Whereas before, if you looked at people like Jackie Kennedy, if you looked at them in the 60s and how they dressed, they wanted to dress like fancy movie stars, members of the aristocracy, dignified, successful people. And little girls and boys wanted to dress in the same way. But by the time the 70s hits, you know, these people want to wear blue jeans and t-shirts and these ugly bell bottoms in these shirts with incredibly flared collars and cheap polyester suits. You should see what the Temptations looked like in the 1960s versus what they looked like in the 70s. In the 60s, I mean, they're wearing beautifully tailored suits with skinny ties. They look so professional. But in the 70s, they're wearing these cheap, ugly polyester suits with these god-awful cuts. I mean, this truly embarrassing stuff. No sane person today would look at the way the Temptations dressed in the 60s versus the way they dressed in the 70s, or really any group, and say, you know what, the people of the 70s, they look a lot more dignified. They look a lot more cultured than the people of the 60s. Yeah, no one's saying that. Okay? And let me give you an example of this value hierarchy when it came to dress, even in the criminal culture. So if you watch something like The Godfather, which I believe takes place in the 1940s, I'm not too certain. You know, Don Corleone and his mafia henchmen and his family members, they were criminals. They were thugs. But they never wanted to present themselves like thugs. They wore, tailored suits with vests. They spoke plain, educated English. They wanted to present themselves as legitimate businessmen, even though they weren't. Look at how street hoods and gangsters and gangbangers present themselves. Do they present themselves as members of the aristocracy? Do they present themselves as people who can positively contribute to a civil society? No, they dress like underclass thugs, and they celebrate the fact that they're underclass thugs. So the point I'm trying to make is, even the criminals in those days wanted to dress up, whereas now the criminals dress down, and they want to dress down. And that's not due to poverty or discrimination or any other nonsense. It's due to a change in societal standards, a debasement of societal standards. Okay? And really my point about this is, human beings are inherently competitive. We assign hierarchies of competence and of dominance. So once we muddy the waters and say that all styles and ways of expression are equal, then it locks you into a caste system. It freezes you into a position, because if everything's the same, why ascend to a higher level? Why work harder? Why have a desire to present yourself in a better fashion if everything's the same and if everything is equal? If you're some underclass person who sags their pants and dresses like a criminal, if all styles are valid, why would you change your appearance? Why would you dress like a civilized, successful person in this country if your way of dress is considered valid? It destroys ambition. It destroys competence. It says that competence doesn't even exist. And those kind of attitudes have been destructive to our society, and especially to people who need an improvement of behavior the most. I was reading in Intellectuals in Society by Thomas Sowell that when Southern blacks moved to the North, where blacks were already integrated, living with the whites and going to school with whites, in newspapers they had advice to Southern blacks, such as, do not use vile language in public, do not litter, do not act like an animal. People would never say that today because they'd be afraid of being called an elitist or racist or some other name, when those people who are lagging need human capital and values and behaviors more than anyone else. So what we're doing is we're hindering people from self-improvement. We're telling them that there is no such thing as improvement because there are no hierarchies. It's utter nonsense. I would never tell a man who dresses like a bum or a criminal or a little boy that it's okay to dress like a little boy. I'd say, you know what, if you want to be treated like an adult, if you want to be seen as a respectable person, get yourself some collared shirts, get yourself a nice pair of slacks, some nice ties, file your nails, shine your shoes, look like a man. Okay? Even just look at the way blacks dressed prior to the 70s. I mean, any kind of picture you'll see of black people in the street. I've seen videos of blacks. They carried themselves in a dignified fashion, even though they're much poorer than they are now. Where they weren't poor is mentally, spiritually, emotionally. Just because you're a poor person does not mean that you can't carry yourself as a dignified person. Just because you're poor doesn't mean that you can't speak proper English. So all the excuses that we've made for poor people does them a great disservice, because we've had people who were poor before who carried themselves in a much more dignified and professional fashion than most poor people do today. Same goes for you young ladies out there. You want respect, but you don't carry yourself in a respectful fashion. You wear these high skirts and these high shorts that leave nothing to the imagination, yet you get upset when a man hits on you. You are advertising your goods, whether you know it or not. If you want to be treated in a respectful fashion, carry yourself in a respectful fashion. If you want to be treated like a whore, dress like a whore. If you want to be treated like a professional, respectable young lady, present yourself like a respectable young lady. The way these women dress today, it makes me sick. You would never see women dressed like that in the 1960s or the 1950s. And I'll never argue that people shouldn't have the freedom to do what they want. But all actions have consequences. I'm sure women back then could dress like whores and harlots. And if they did, they'd be criticized for it. But now, if a woman dresses like a whore or a harlot, if someone like me says something about it, I'm the bad guy. I didn't force her to dress like a whore or a harlot. I didn't force her to wear those extremely tight pants and the crop tops and all that other stuff. I didn't force her to wear those things. So why are you blaming me? I'm just calling it the way I see it. Okay? Let's move on, man. Tattoos. It's another one I don't like. Tattoos were once reserved for criminals and vagabonds. Gentlemen and ladies in the old days did not wish to adhere to underclass behavior. Yeah, that's all changed. I'm going to give you a quick example. NBA stars like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Julius Erving, etc. did not have tattoos. They carried themselves as professionals on and off the court. They wore suits, so on and so forth. By the mid-90s, tattooed NBA players like Dennis Rodman started becoming the norm. I remember Dennis Rodman as a kid. He was known as the guy with tattoos. If today, watching the NBA, you say, oh, you know, the guy with tattoos, people would be like, which one? Because all of them have tattoos. I would say a minority of NBA players don't have tattoos today. That was not the case 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Okay? And, you know, my hypothesis, I was talking to my brother about this, was the rise of tattooed NBA players, I'm sure, coincides with the rise of fatherless families and illegitimacy. A lot of these guys, these Allen Iversons of the world, they're coming up in an environment that glorifies criminality and social deviance and violence. There are no respectable fathers around taking care of their kids, showing their kids how men present themselves, how men act, how men speak. So my hypothesis was, if you look at the NBA draft and you see how many guys come from fatherless families, that perhaps can coincide with the level of tattoo and the amount of tattoos that they have. I could be wrong, but when it comes to social degeneration, I think the proliferation of illegitimacy and the proliferation of tattoos and criminality are pretty much hand in hand. Theodore Dalrymple in Life at the Bottom talked about this as well. He was saying You know, in the days of old, if you wanted to know who the criminals were, they had tattoos. He said virtually all the criminals he interviewed in his practice had tattoos. But he was especially worried at the fact that in previous decades, the upper class fashion would cipher down to the lower class, and lower class people would aspire to dress like upper class people. But now it's the exact reverse. You see upper class people wanting to dress like lower class people. You see them wanting to get the tattoos. You see them wanting to use the slang and the improper speech patterns of underclass people. You see the upper class people wanting to adopt underclass music, the rap crap, and all that other nonsense. And to me, it really shows a perversion of values here. Why, if you're a successful person, why would you want to copy unsuccessful people? If you're a successful person, why would you want to emulate dysfunctional people? And I think the cause of that is the cultural revolution of the 60s and these ideas of non-judgmentalism and multiculturalism and moral and cultural relativism, that nothing is better or worse and everything is just different, and it's not. I was on Rodeo Drive going to work a few weeks back, and I see a beautiful young lady, and she has this huge ostentatious tattoo on her forearm. And I thought to myself, who would think that young lady would make a good wife? Who would think that she'd be a good homemaker? That she'd pass down good values and traditions to your children? I didn't think that. I looked at that woman and I thought, this is a woman that is lost. This is a woman who has been brainwashed by ideas from the left, like cultural and moral relativism, like feminism and non-judgmentalism. Because if you weren't brainwashed by those things, you wouldn't get a tattoo like that on your arm. You wouldn't defile your body in that way. You wouldn't adopt underclass fashion and behavior if you understood that we have a value hierarchy when it comes to the way that we present ourselves. And it's really unfortunate to me just how many of these girls these days have tattoos. Like, this is a relatively new phenomenon. I'm sure if you went back to 1960 and we tried to find out how many women had tattoos, it'd probably be slim to none. Now I'm sure that number has increased tenfold, 20-fold, 100-fold. No grace, no dignity, no class, no virtue. And cuckolded men are scared to defend our values and to tell these women, no, that's not the way you present yourself. That is not attractive. Where are the mothers telling these women, no, that's not how young ladies present themselves? Young ladies are dignified. They're professional. They're kind. They're sweet. They don't get tattoos like bikers and gangbangers. Okay? They don't present themselves like whores and harlots and heroin addicts. What's up with that? So now I'm going to talk about the meaning of clothing, okay? Human beings make decisions about other human beings in a matter of seconds. They determine whether someone is trustworthy or untrustworthy in milliseconds. That is an evolved trait that helped our ancestors survive. When we talk about the meaning of clothing, here's an example. Kings and queens draped themselves in purple clothing because purple dye was so expensive. They didn't wear what peasants wore. They didn't wear what the poor wore. They wore clothes that signified to other people that they were atop the dominant hierarchy. They were the most successful. They were the most privileged. They showed it. They weren't ashamed of that. They weren't scared to show people that they were royalty. Police, for example, they wear certain uniforms to show us what kind of occupation that they do. Firemen as well. Astronauts. If we saw an astronaut in plain clothes, we wouldn't know that he's an astronaut because he's not wearing the gear that astronauts wear. It's common sense. If clothing didn't carry meaning and value, we wouldn't even have Halloween. How could you dress up as other people or as other occupations if the meaning of clothing is as arbitrary? How do we know whether you're a fireman or a nurse if clothing doesn't carry meaning? It makes no sense. So when I see someone dressed like a thug, when I see them with their pants sagging and they have a hood over their head, I'm going to think that they're a thug. Maybe they're not a thug. But the fact that they're dressing like a thug shows me that they're, one, either a thug, or two, they are sympathetic to the values and behaviors and the culture of thugs and the underclass. So either way, I don't want to be around people like that. Perhaps if you're dressed like my man Morris Day or my man Terry Lewis, they're always dressed in nice suits and ties, so on and so forth, I wouldn't think that of you because you're dressed like a civilized professional person. I was watching a special. I don't even know it's a special. It was just a video on Louder with Crowder when he was debunking the idea that thug is the new N-word, which is not. And he would show people on the street pictures of blacks and whites, and people would determine whether that person was a thug or not based on not based on their skin color, but based on the way that they were dressed. So if you showed someone a picture of Bill Cosby and asked, "Is that a thug?" they'd say no, because Bill Cosby doesn't dress like a thug. But if you showed them a picture of Tupac and asked, "Is this a thug?" Yes, because he dresses like a thug. He presents himself like a thug. He celebrated thug life and criminality and social deviance and incompetence. If you showed a white person, some CEO of a company, dressed in a nice suit, would you say he's a thug? You'd say no. But if you showed them some underclass, white thug in Britain with tattoos and missing teeth, so on and so forth, you think that he was a thug, not because of his skin color, but the way that he presents himself. So if you don't want to be seen as a thug, don't dress like a damn thug. If you don't want to be seen like a whore, don't dress like a damn whore. It's that simple. It's really unfair to people to say that you shouldn't be judged by the way that you present yourself. You should be judged by, I don't know, who you are as a person. But the way you dress is signifying to the world something that you value as a person. No one has the time to get to know each and every single person that they see on the street in a personal manner. No one has that much time, nor would someone want that much time to waste on something like that. So what do? We use clothing to signify what we value and who we are as people, our occupations, our values, our morals. Okay? So if you're dressed like a whore, maybe you do have the behavior of a nun. I don't know, but I would guarantee you that most girls who are dressed like that don't have behaviors of nuns. Just like if you see a nun, you wouldn't expect most of them to have whorish behavior traits. Okay? Maybe the guy who's dressed like a thug isn't a thug, but the fact that he's dressed like a thug is going to make people think that he's a thug. It's that simple. So here are my implications. Hold yourself to a high standard and be conscientious about the way that you're presenting yourself to others. If you don't stand up for your principles, you will fall. We cannot allow multiculturalism and non-judgmentalism to balkanize our world any further. Because if you go to places like Saudi Arabia, in these no-go zones, in France and Sweden, so on and so forth, and you're a woman and you're dressed like a whore, they're not going to just say, "Oh yeah, that's perfectly okay. That's perfectly acceptable. Everything goes, no value judgments." No, they're going to beat you and rape you. And I'm not saying that that's right. But what I'm saying is, these cultures and these ideologies that we are at war with are not allowing themselves to be defeated and to be emasculated by these ideas from the left. They will stand for their values. They will champion their values through life or death. We know that by over 20,000 terrorist attacks in the name of Islam since 9/11. They are not scared to die for their values. Okay? I'm not saying that we should die for our values, but we need to defend our values because our enemies will not defend our values. They will impose their values on us. And if they do succeed, we will not have non-judgmentalism. We will not have multiculturalism. We will have monoculturalism. And if you don't fall into what they say and what they do, you will be punished by law. Okay? That's the Lord Gord Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Share it. Like it. Donate on Patreon. Get the Lord Gord album. This isn't TV. If you're in LA, come to the Blues Jam at the Airliner in Lincoln Heights every Tuesday from 9 p.m. to midnight. Free admission. $1 tacos. It's a good deal. Next week, I'm going to be talking about social media, our addiction to social media, the negative effects of social media, and why I stopped using social media. I'm Lord Gord, and I'll see you next time.